looking forward to this, so thanks for kind of being here. This is great. So I teach history at a local prep school and part-time at the community college, but this is like not my field, but I'm really enjoying kind of dusting off some like old research. On the drive in, I realized the core of this, or part of it, was like a paper I wrote in grad school about John Knox's Book of Discipline that was rejected by the Journal of Presbyterian History when I submitted it. So it did not make it through the peer-reviewed process, but it's good enough for you, I guess. So sorry. Okay, so we've got our handouts. So as I was thinking about kind of the story to tell, originally, we're just going to talk about the next chapter and what Randy was discussing last week. We're going to talk about kind of Mary Tudor trying to undo a lot of the reforms that had preceded her in the Church of England. But, you know, as I'm making my notes and going like, well, we've got to talk about this, and we've got to talk about that, but this needs contextualization, and so I'm not really sure what I've ended up with. There's just a lot going on, so feel free to make it a dialogue if you like, but I'll start kind of telling the story. So to a large extent, we're going to talk about Scotland today. You know, the focus has been on English Reformation recently. So what we're going to look at is the process of Mary Tudor, who followed Edward VI, we learned about last week, trying to undo a lot of these reforms. She's the infamous Bloody Mary, and that's what we're looking at. But we're also going to focus to a large extent on John Knox. So in this time period, we're talking the mid-16th century, 1560s. The Scottish Reformation is happening from the bottom up. There are nobles involved too. There's a group of nobles called the Lords of the Congregation. They've gained control of the government. The Scottish royal family is firmly supporting the kind of traditional Roman church. But there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of connections. In this context, Scotland is kind of permanently bouncing between factions that want a closer or less close relationship with England, those who want a firm alliance with France as to kind of provide some support in their regular conflicts with England. Like, there's just a lot going on. So I'm going to try to keep it pretty simple, but, you know, if I'm leaving out important parts of the narrative, feel free to ask. But, all right, so we'll start with John Knox himself. John Knox, the most significant figure in this time period in the Scottish Reformation. He's born in a border town called Haddington, and the borderlands between Scotland and England. It's a pretty mixed area. When these conflicts happen, this place is regularly raised. People kind of bounce back and forth across the border. So he's very much kind of a transitional figure in many different ways. So let me establish some of the Marys that are kind of setting the scene in this time period. So the first is Mary Tudor. She is the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine, the one he very much wanted to divorce, we've learned about. So Mary Tudor is his daughter, who was a disappointment because she was female, and then for the reasons we learned about previously, became kind of disinherited. Long story short, she assumed the English throne after her brother, Edward VI, tried to undo these reforms, instituted some pretty robust persecutions. This is how she earned the name Bloody Mary. And let's see, our first blank. Okay, so under Mary Tudor's rule, John Knox had come to England. He goes back and forth pretty often. Knox's trauma under her rule led him to believe that kneeling at communion was not a matter of indifference. He argued it was a step towards adoring the physical elements. And so this is in the context of the creation of the Book of Common Prayer, which Randy told us about, and Thomas Cranmer, and I'll come back to that a little bit. Okay, so the Crown is trying to undo the reforms that have been happening. And so Mary Tudor takes on this title, or through history, of Bloody Mary for a bunch of reasons, but there are hundreds and hundreds of Protestants who are martyred under her. She saw herself as kind of cauterizing a wound and of burning these heretics who were Protestants. And this is not unique to her. Heretics being burned instead of beheaded was a pretty ordinary thing to do to prevent their bodies from becoming relics, and it was intended to kind of mimic the fires of hell that they anticipated them receiving. However, these public executions were such spectacles, and for the most part, these are commoners, not aristocrats, being publicly executed, that they ended up backfiring because they were such sympathetic figures, and it's widely believed at the time and now that these executions really did generate sympathy for the Protestant cause across England. The most important figure, or the first one, was a fellow named John Rogers, whose wife and 11 children came to hug him on the way to the execution. And this is all, a very dramatic scene for the crowd to observe. And there were a series of, kind of painful scenes to watch. And so this generated a lot of sympathy. The next significant group and that happened in a famous market called Smithfield in London. The next big group were in Oxford, which included killing a series of bishops. Thomas Cranmer, we learned about, had to watch some of his colleagues being killed. It was kind of, a psychological intention to hurt him before he himself was publicly executed. So this is really getting quite gruesome. Publicly, one of the bishops being executed said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley," to his colleague. "We shall this day light a candle, which by God's grace in England, I trust shall never be put out." And so those are the kind of compelling narratives that really stimulated sympathy for the Protestant cause. Let's see. And then most significantly, these deaths that I'm describing for you, we know because they were depicted by one of the Protestants named Fox, who wrote Fox's Book of Martyrs, and kind of these very dramatic kind of hagiography. They're most likely exaggerated to some extent, depictions of these executions. Fox's Book of Martyrs is very much part of a genre at the time, celebrating and highlighting kind of Roman Catholic abuses at this time. This is the same decade that a famous booklet was published by De las Casas, which was describing kind of atrocities by the Spanish in the New World. And so Fox's Book of Martyrs, with these very colorful woodcuts of kind of dramatic flames and dramatic bloodshed, took off, very much, very, very popular reading. We still make reference to it today. Okay, so big picture, these Mary Tudor persecutions of commoners generated a tremendous amount of sympathy. There were persecutions of Protestants in Spain, persecutions of Protestants in Italy, but for the most part, these were kind of leading church figures, not just regular commoners, and so their persecution just did not seem to generate the sympathy that it did happen here in England. Okay, so the next figure, let's talk about Mary de Guise, who was the Queen of Scotland. She was French. She had married James, who died, King James in Scotland, and so she found herself queen, the regent for her daughter, Mary Stuart, who we usually call Mary, Queen of Scots. And so Mary de Guise very much saw herself as protecting kind of the Roman faith. Knox and others saw her very much as a foreign kind of interloper trying to occupy Scotland. So in this story, there's a lot of nationalism, kind of tribal ethnic identity as well. So it's not just, a purely religious disagreement. That's probably worth mentioning. Okay, so then the last of these three Marys that I'm mentioning to you is Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart. She's like the most famous. She's the tragic one. She, as a child, as a baby, was, according to treaty, betrothed to the boy, future king of England, Edward VI. And then that was undone. England tried to reinforce this treaty to kind of re-up this marriage pledge between a little boy and a baby girl in what it was called the rough wooing, where England was attacking Scotland to kind of reinforce this marriage engagement, which I've always thought was kind of a humorous description. But regardless, a new treaty was made with France, where she was betrothed to the future king of France. And so as a baby, part of the treaty, went to Paris and then spent the first 16 years of her life living very comfortably, very glamorously in the most sophisticated, the most wealthy royal household in Europe. And so as a 16-year-old, came back to Scotland, and at that point, she found herself in a country that had recently become, to a large extent, reformed. Scotland had a new parliament where they had made some pretty significant changes according to the Reformation, and she was a very devout Roman Catholic, but she was young, and this is the context in which she has a series of discussions with John Knox. John Knox himself, let's see, I've got a blank here coming up, don't I? So she had a series of discussions with John Knox, who met with her a series of times, and John Knox did not mince words. He told the Queen that her conscience was confounded by error, and essentially established a really important principle that even the monarch is subject to the word of God in a way that previously was contended. So Knox himself, not a noble, came from a common background. He, as a young man, was a Roman Catholic priest. So he was educated, trained as a lawyer, became persuaded by these new Protestant ideas coming from Germany to a large extent, especially by a young preacher named Wishart, George Wishart. John Knox persuaded Wishart to let Knox, who was a physically imposing guy, be his bodyguard. So Knox followed Wishart around with one of those enormous two-handed Scottish claymore swords, a kind of an imposing figure. And Wishart was later found guilty under Mary de Guise, found guilty of heresy, publicly burned, gruesomely burned. Knox wrote a book describing these experiences and the graphic. But once again, this kind of public moral clarity really did galvanize kind of the Protestant cause. In response, the last Roman cardinal in Scotland, his name was Beaton. He was the guy who had arranged for Wishart to be executed. Some of the Protestants in this very kind of rough and woolly time period responded not by writing letters, but by attacking Cardinal Beaton, who was living in a magnificent castle in St. Andrews. And so they stormed the castle. There was some construction going on, and they slipped in as construction workers. Surrounded Beaton, and he said, "You cannot kill me, I am a priest." And then they killed him. And so then they occupied the castle for about a year. So this is not a normal religious dispute. And anyway, after about a year, some French forces came to kind of reassert Roman power, captured the castle. The Protestants inside, including John Knox, who had joined during this year, were captured, and they were sentenced not to prison, but to galley slavery, which was a particularly gruesome form of punishment. At this time, commerce, to a large extent, depended on these big galley ships with teams of rowers. And so John Knox spent 19 months, literally chained to his thwart on one of these. And the conditions of he didn't really say much about this in his own writing, But we know, a fair amount about galley slavery from other writings in this time period, and the conditions are gruesome. You can just imagine. There's no covering, so you're sunburned and blistered. You're literally chained to it, which includes there's no opportunity to leave for natural relief. You're just in your filth, and disease is rampant, and it gets really bad. Then there's this religious element, because the ship he was on was called the Notre Dame, and the priest on board would celebrate mass and kind of insist that in the participation of these rebellious Protestants, and Knox kind of became a notable figure for hardening the resolve of the other guys on board and insisting don't look upon the icon, which was kind of mashed in his face. And anyway, there's a famous incident where he grabbed a hold of the icon of Mary and tossed it in the water, and he famously declared, "Let Our Lady now save herself. She is light enough. Let her learn to swim." And he's a colorful character. He got a reputation because of this very, public example of resolve. So, long story short, England, by this time, Mary Tudor is dead. England, once again returning to be a Protestant country, negotiated for these Protestants to be released. Long story short. John Knox himself doesn't write much, but we're pretty sure that's what happened. He goes to England, and this is where he works with Thomas Cranmer, who is not yet executed. I guess my story is a little out of order. And working with Cranmer, as Cranmer's kind of finishing the Book of Common Prayer that Randy was describing last week, and Knox's role is significant because of what's called the Black Rubric, where he couldn't stop the elements of the new Reformed worship that still looked and smelled to Knox's ear too similar to Rome, but he did include basically an addendum, a pamphlet we call the Black Rubric, in the Book of Common Prayer, which is no longer in there today. It's you won't find it now, but originally it was for quite a while, and it basically clarifies, all right, we know that you're kneeling here according to the liturgy, but kneeling doesn't indicate veneration or worship. It's simply a matter of what's the word he used? I'm sorry. It was more about just the mechanics of ordering the worship service to be efficient. He made it very clear there's no actual veneration in the Roman sense happening. Okay. Knox has a series of times when he flees due to these persecutions. One of the times he flees, goes to continental Europe, goes to Geneva, spends quite a bit of time in Geneva, becomes very influenced by the model that Calvin is using to organize the Genevan church. It's in this context, by fleeing these Mary Tudor persecutions, that he writes his famous book, The First Blast of the Trumpet, against the monstrous regiment of women. And it sounds like a harsh book, and to some degree it is, but in the context of saying that the thesis is basically that women should not rule countries, in the context of Mary Tudor, the first Queen of England, using this power to persecute the church, I think it perhaps is a bit more understandable. But the trouble, though, is Mary Tudor, after she's dead, and Queen Elizabeth, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth, comes to the throne and begins to restore these Protestant reforms. Elizabeth will have nothing to do with Knox, because he's just written this book declaring that women ought not to be rulers, and therefore, of course, it threatens her legitimacy. So in the long run, the book was perhaps, not quite a politically savvy thing to do. Knox ultimately returns to Scotland after these persecutions, and he starts building the church and the model that he sees in Geneva. He called Geneva the most perfect school of Christ since the apostles, very influenced by Geneva. This is the context in which he has a series of discussions with the young Mary Queen of Scots. And Knox, we know about these discussions because Knox wrote them down later in a book he wrote about the history of the Reformation of Scotland. And I'll read for the transcript as Knox describes it of one of these discussions. Remember, she's a teenage girl and he's 40-something at this point. Queen Mary asked, "Think ye that subjects having the power may resist their princes?" Knox responded, "If their princes exceed their bounds, madam, no doubt they may be resisted, even by power." And so, essentially, she is scandalized and shocked at the idea that he is suggesting that leaders who do a bad job ruling, he gives the example of like a father of a household who goes crazy and like is threatening his children, like are they not justified in like taking away his sword and resisting him? And so she responds with, "Well then, I perceive that my subjects shall obey you and not me. They shall do what they list, what they want, and not what I command. And so must I be subject to them and not they to me." So you can see the dangerous principle that Knox's theology is having political implications, kind of creating, undermining the legitimacy of the divine right of kings, that to resist the king is to go against God. And so Knox becomes like a dangerous figure for more reasons than just reorganizing the church. Although, of course, reorganizing the church, that was clearly Knox's primary motivation. The political implications are, not even second, they're tertiary to him. Now, when Knox is reforming the church, he writes the first book of discipline, kind of an ancestor of our book of church order, basically outlining, okay, here's how the church is going to be organized. And it really laid out a couple of important principles. Most significantly, the role of the churches creating schools so that the laity, the commoners, could read the Bible, which is a tradition that we're familiar with in our context. This is common with Puritans in the English tradition. And then the other one is like a really robust and large system of like providing for the poor. And this is tradition kind of later developed by a famous 19th century Presbyterian named Thomas Chalmers, who kind of took this and is still lauded for his efforts. The trouble is, and the reason why it never actually quite shook out the way that Knox anticipated, is his funding mechanism was going to be land that had formerly been part of the Roman Church, the Church of Scotland, when it was still in communion with Rome. They owned roughly 50% of the land in Scotland, like a staggering amount. And then in this decade and a half of kind of slow incremental reform, our bishops are no longer in subjection to the Bishop of Rome, and now we're starting to get rid of the office of bishop altogether. In the meantime, those lands, for the most part, had been kind of acquired by the Scottish nobility. And so by Knox now planning on what to do with this land, to use it to generate funds for public schools or kind of church schools and for care for the poor, the nobility now had a vested interest to stop this process. So on one hand, they're on board with reform. On the other hand, this is, once their wallets are threatened, they become much less enthusiastic. So in Knox's Book of Discipline, starts restructuring the Church of Scotland. We're really talking about Knox to a large extent because you and I are currently in a Presbyterian church. To a large extent, we look to Knox as it's not fair to say the originator of Presbyterianism, but to start organizing a church in this form. And that's true to a large extent, but he's a much more transitional figure. He's much more flexible to church polity than you might anticipate. So for example, his Book of Discipline, kind of the predecessor of our Book of Church Order, which our denomination uses, it included an office called superintendent, which is basically an elder, but it's like a super elder. It's an elder in charge of a series of local sessions. And the district that he's assigned roughly correlated to the old diocese. And so you can see this figure is kind of like a bishop. They're just not calling him a bishop. But it was only around for 15, 20 years because after Knox dies, it's replaced by a different system. It was replaced by a different system. One of Knox's lieutenants, wait, I want to go in order so I'm not missing blank, sorry. I'm just having such a good time talking. Okay. Let me come to the next section, and then I'll come back to the Book of Church Order, the Book of Discipline, as they called it. So while Scotland really was struggling for kind of like the soul of the country and this reform, and Queen Mary's resisting, something similar is happening on continental Europe. France, for a couple of generations, was increasingly Protestant. Like the Huguenots, the Protestant activity in France for not just the 16th century, but well into the 17th century, really were like a large, meaningful presence in a way that sounds foreign to us today. We think about Protestantism in France, and there's not much to speak about. But at this time, there really was. And in art, in 1572, there was a significant marriage between an important Protestant, Henry of Navarre, and an important Roman Catholic figure in the French family, and I'm leaving out some details. And because there were so many Protestants coming to Paris for this wedding, the mother of one of these figures, Catherine of Medici, a very notable figure for a lot of reasons, arranged for these Protestants to be attacked on St. Bartholomew's Day. And so the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is about as brutal as it gets. I mean, we're talking like just people being grabbed, men, women, children, pregnant women, famously, like just kind of hacked to pieces, like publicly on street corners in Paris. And the number, and then it spread from Paris to like, neighboring towns. And no real particular records were kept, but our best guess is maybe as many as 30,000 Protestants, like a staggering number. And in this context, the Pope was so pleased with this massacre of Christians, in our tradition, that he had a medal struck, which is the same sort of thing you would do after like a tremendous battle or something. And so in this context, a couple generations later, when the Westminster Standards are created and the first early editions kind of equate the Bishop of Rome with the spirit of the Antichrist in a way that, like, in our context, like the Pope today is like kind of a grandfatherly figure. He looks pretty friendly and he cheers for the Cubs. But like in this context, it makes a lot more sense, that such a celebration of murder of Christians, like you can see and perhaps be a bit more sympathetic to this idea of equating him in this context. We've taken it out, so it's no longer in our Westminster Standards today. Okay, so let's see. Forgive me. So at St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, it solidified the Scottish belief that the Antichrist was working through civil monarchs to destroy the true church. You probably could have guessed that one. All right. And then, as Knox is reforming the church, he didn't just want a new church, he wanted a new society. So he proposed using this wealth confiscated from the Roman church that I mentioned. And so he really saw kind of a three-legged stool approach to kind of reforming Scottish society. There was going to be the Kirk, the church. Kirk is just, church in Scots. Which Scots is like, it's not a dialect of English, it's just like a different branch of English. It developed, it's not like some branch that started changing. It just kind of a different tradition of English. So there's got the Kirk, you have the poor, taking care of the poor, for the body, the physical body, and then the school for the mind of the nation. So this is the tradition that Knox is kind of proposing, the lines along which Scottish society should be reformed. All right, I'm going to speed this up. Knox dies pretty soon after, not really that sure that the Reformation in Scotland is going to stick, I mean, at a time in which there are very few limits on the king's power, you get a new monarch, and you have whiplash as far as these reforms. For example, Mary Tudor's persecutions, there were a handful of Protestants literally on the pyre with, bundles of sticks being pushed up against them, and word came out that the Queen had died across town, and a messenger, and therefore unable to sign to the paperwork necessary for them to actually their death warrant. That's how it works. She had to sign everything, and so for that reason, they were left free. That was it. She's dead. Persecution's over. And so in this context, we have when Knox is dying, it's not clear that the next leader of Scotland will be amenable to the Reformation. So he can take nothing for granted. So one of his top lieutenants, a guy named Melville, Andrew Melville, he's the one we should really see as kind of the architect of Presbyterianism as you and I know it. His second book of discipline, 1578, this really does create the presbytery as an institution. So previously we had sessions of elders, but the presbytery as a local region of elders making an additional council, that really we can point quite clearly to Melville's second book of discipline, 1578, so 18 years after the first book of discipline. Melville insisted on the parity, the equality of elders. And this is an important principle in our denomination today. If every elder is equal in authority, the king therefore has no bishop or archbishop or superintendent to kind of grab control of the local church, of the kirk. This is why Melville, just as Knox met with Mary Stuart, so Melville would meet with the next king, King James VI of Scotland. He later became King James I of England. And Melville famously grabbed James VI by the sleeve, calling him God's silly vassal. But silly meaning, in this context, kind of weak or simple, not so much goofy. But he reminded James that in the church, he was not a lord, but a subject. He's a member of the church. He's not over the church. And on paper, at least, that's still how it works in the Church of Scotland. The monarch is a member of the local church. So if you want to get really pedantic, Queen Elizabeth II died a Presbyterian because she died in Scotland a few years back. She's technically just a regular member in that context when she hits above the border. Please.
This King James VI, was that Mary Stuart's son who was Queen of Scotland? And how did she get in line for the throne, or was in line for the English throne? They all were intermarrying and stuff like that.
That's precisely it. Sure. So Mary Stuart, daughter of Mary de Guise, in the royal family of Elizabeth Tudor in England, because they're all intermarried. She had a claim on the English throne, which was a source of constant tension between the two, as Mary Stuart in Scotland is bickering with the Protestants and sometimes threatened. She sometimes looks to Elizabeth to kind of bail her out because they are a family. Ultimately, that's not how it worked out. Mary, Queen of Scots, eventually will flee to England and find herself under house arrest for the last 19 years of her life, and then be executed. And so, this is the context in which, there's a lot going on. She had a series of husbands, one of whom died in an explosion, but he was also strangled because they found there's a lot of intrigue going on. Yeah. And so James VI, was he her son? I should know that. Forgive me.
I think she was.
Yeah.
I've tried to read about it, but it's a little confusing keeping these married straight. But I think that's the.
Sure.
So he eventually became this King of Scotland and England.
That's right.
He was the first king of both Scotland and England.
Right. Yeah. 1605, and then for the next century there'll be a single monarch until 1707, when the union is kind of made formal. Yeah, thank you. There's a lot going on, right? Okay. So, let's see. Oh yeah, we'll go back to Andrew Melville. So this principle that the church is, subject to the king, but that subjection is limited, is really the origin of, what's usually referred to as two kingdoms idea, the two kingdoms theology. The state holds the power of the sword, the church holds the power of the keys, which is like the spiritual discipline. So, so the church's power is spiritual in nature. The church is not, enforcing church discipline by locking people in church jail or that sort of thing. It's a principle that seems like a no-brainer to you and I, but that's because this is to a large extent kind of the origin of our tradition that, we live in. So it might seem unremarkable, but thinking about the fact that people lived and died to create kind of the furniture in the room in which we live, Yeah, that's too strong a word, separation, but certainly principled limits on what the king can do, sure, and limits on the, what later would be called the spirituality of the church, the idea that the church's power is, limited to what the Word of God says, not, more temporal concerns. So, there's a lot to be said, but this is kind of like a lot of the articulation of important biblical principles, which previously had been quite jumbled. All right, and then I'll just say a few words about like why we're talking about this. It's my view that it's not really necessary for me to say, and kind of here's why it matters, and here's the significance. I'm of the perspective that history reveals its own truths. It's a value just for studying in itself. However, we are Presbyterians in America, so I'll say a word or two about the process of it coming here. The most significant figure as Presbyterians left Scotland and went to the colonies. For our purposes, the most significant figure is a figure named Francis Makemie, who organized the first presbytery in Philadelphia in 1706. So we're talking several generations after this. He fought for religious liberty against the Anglican governors of New York. And in the colonies, in the Reformed, broad-speaking world, there's a lot of back and forth. So Scottish Presbyterians, to a large extent, it was like an ethnic designation, not so much theological. It was how our churches, our polity is organized. So there are a lot of figures. Jonathan Edwards comes to mind, who's a Congregationalist, a Puritan, but bounced back and forth between Presbyterian pulpits, and he died the principal of a Presbyterian college in New Jersey. And the principle that we've kind of discussed a little bit, where John Knox is arguing to the Queen about the principle that she could be resisted if she threatens the liberty, the safety of her people. This is pretty clear, or at least many people at the time believed it to be pretty clear in the context of the American Revolution. So they frequently referred to the American Revolution or the English officers on the ground as a Presbyterian rebellion. They described it in kind of like the context of the old Scottish rebellions against English authority. Here I have a quotation for you. This is a British officer in the colonies. His name was John Hughes. He wrote this in Philadelphia in 1766, so kind of preceding the American Revolution, but tensions are rising. My lords, the colonists have been insulting His Majesty, saying that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional and oppressive. It is apparent to many people here that the Presbyterians are at the head of these riots. They are opposed to kings, and some cry out, "No king but King Jesus." The leaders fill every newspaper with inflammatory pieces so that the minds of the common people are kept in continual ferment. No one dares write anything that could calm the people down. Doing so would put the writer's life and fortune in danger. I am convinced that the Presbyterians intend nothing less than the throwing off of their allegiance and obedience to this Majesty, and forming a republican empire in America and being lords and masters themselves. And so I think the connection is like not hard to make, between these principles that Knox is laying down and several generations later. Okay, so I'll say a word or two about Andrew Melville's second book of discipline, and we really should see it as like the predecessor. I mean, it's quite explicitly the predecessor of our book of church order that we use. So we maintain that the church's power is strictly spiritual, as did Knox, as did Melville, and we don't meddle in civil politics or use the sword, to a large extent because of the narrative that I'm explaining to you. We remember how the state has used the church, to oppress us. And because Christ is the head, no bishop or government can tell a church in our denomination who the pastor should be. The congregation has the exclusive right to elect their own officers. This is our hard-won crown right of King Jesus. And so these principles about the congregation, basically the church elders proposing a candidate and then the congregation agreeing to it, that goes straight back to John Knox, and it goes straight back to Geneva, and then Knox brought that to Scotland. And so our tradition is very much, quite clearly here. Great. Let's see, how have I done? We have a few minutes. Yeah, but I've really enjoyed kind of like dusting off some of these ideas. It's been a while for me. Happy to have a dialogue or take questions. Did I get all the blanks? Did I miss any? Oh, forgive me. What have we missed? School. Yeah. School for the mind.
And number 8. And 9.
Sure. 8 is keys. Sure.
I'm sorry.
Keys. Yeah, but the church holds the power of the keys. In the context of like Peter binding things, in the same way our elders,
Got it. And number 9.
are presbytery. Yeah, the first presbytery in Philadelphia, 1706. It's very much like the middle colonies were the most diverse. That's where the Scottish immigrants went, and so that's kind of where they brought. And so obviously the Presbyterian Church today is no longer like this ethnic thing associated with Scotland, but I still think it's appropriate that, we understand to a large extent, but American Presbyterianism, like America, we've got a lot of Dutch influence and a lot of evangelical influence, like there's just a lot of background. It's no longer tied to like an ethnic identity, like even Lutherans still have like a lot of Scandinavian and German and, kind of like ties in a way that, Presbyterianism, like we gave that up quite a long time ago. Please.
Francis Mackman, having grown up in a Presbyterian church all my life, I've never read about him and heard about him. I mean, he's obviously an important character in our culture, in our faith, but,
Yeah.
has he written about that much?
I mean, I think he's important perhaps as a symbol. He himself, Scots-Irish guy from Ulster, part of a larger wave. Persecuted is too strong a word, but there's a lot of bickering between, the colonies all had their own established churches. And so, he was hassled for preaching without authorization as a Presbyterian and not within the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. So no, I mean, he's a pretty interesting figure. He didn't leave, remarkable writings particularly. He was a humble pastor in the way that, in probably the best tradition of like, the backbone of the church. Think of like the generation of elders who have done the labor that we don't know their names, and they would be fine with that. They ran the race, and like now they're forgotten, and that's fine. Yeah. All right, well, I believe our time is up.
11 and 12.
Oh, 11 and 12? Sure. Let's see. So 11, so the church's power is strictly spiritual. And then 12, the congregation has the exclusive right to elect their own officers. Yeah. Yeah, so, it's not reasonable to call the church like a democratic institution, but there are elements of, the congregation having, a voice, power, yeah. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I enjoyed that. I appreciate it. Yeah.